As Visualizing Palestine, this is the 8th year that we're in operation. And we have known Dr. Salman for a number of years. And I was personally lucky with my co-founder, Ramzi Jaber, to visit his office in Kuwait around 2013. And he just reminded me that I actually had met him also in Amman, better memory than mine, and that he had met Ahmed Barkley in London as well. So it goes back quite far. And a large part of the data that you saw in the exhibit downstairs a few days back was actually based on data that Dr. Salman has actually been working on for his lifetime. So we're very appreciative, and we're honored to have you. We're also honored to have you also represented in 3 generations, your grandchildren being here. That's really quite a unique moment. So thank you, and Ahmed is my partner at Visualizing Palestine as well, and will be holding the conversation, and we'll have you engaged afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jumana. I should probably start by apologizing that, this is a relatively short conversation and Q&A, and there's no chance we're gonna cover a whole lot. So we had, in a way, a dress rehearsal last week when Jumana and I spoke about 7 years of Visualizing Palestine, and we didn't manage to cover a quarter of what we intended. So to cover, Salman's life work in an hour is really not going to be possible. But hopefully we can make a start, and what I'm really hoping is that we can come out with some insights that you wouldn't necessarily get through seeing a number of Salman's presentations that you can probably see online or reading his books, and really. One fascinating thing, when speaking with anyone is really what motivates the work that you do. So it would be great to understand, what is, to you the value of this documentation work of Palestine that you've kind of committed your life to, and eventually where did it start? But you can.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can you hear me? Thanks first to Darren Nimmer, who hosted this event. Thank you, all of you who have come on short notice. I appreciate that. And thanks to Jumana and Ahmed and the team who invited me. It's a pleasure to speak to you, not only in the subject, but to see several generations present here, which means that the idea is still alive. I'm sure many of you have heard about the slogan that Palestine is a land without people. I also fell for this myth for a long time. Why do they say that, Palestine is a land without people? And when you scour the 19th century documents, you see that they are saying this over and over in Europe, in Christian Zionism, in imperial British archives, about this all the time. Palestine is a land without people. Why do they say that? It's surprising because they know that it is not a land without people. How do they know that? For example, the British came to Palestine in 1870, and they spent 4 years. They documented Palestine and have 13,000 names listed in 26 maps and 10 big volumes. The French also sent Victor Gourin, who wrote 10 volumes about Palestinian villages. And it is surprising that they keep propagating the idea that Palestine is a land without people. Moreover, the Zionist Commission in the peace conference in Paris, in Versailles, 1919, presented a map to the colonial powers, mainly Britain and France, asking them to take over Palestine, the Zionists to take over Palestine, because it's empty land. And they have presented a map, which I have a copy of, showing that hatching over all Palestine and say pasture land for shepherds, people who come with their sheep and then they go back to somewhere else, maybe in Big Arabia. It is very surprising that people who knew so much about Palestine, even the German Van de Velde in 1850 made a huge and detailed map of Palestine. Don't even mention the British Admiralty, which scored all Palestinian shores and had maps of them. How could this difference in opinion or in statement be explained? And then it dawned on me that this was, of course, very deliberate, because Palestine, the land without people, is not a myth. It was a plan to make Palestine a land without people. And that's what the Zionists have done since 1917 till today, to actually convert the myth into a reality. Tell the Western people that there is no problem, there is nobody there, but in actual fact, all the colonial powers, all the Zionist groups knew it is a lie, but they wanted to convert Palestine into a land without people, which they have done largely in 1948. So that is one of the reasons that this myth was propagated. It is not a myth intended to deceive people, but it was a plan of action which they have worked to do over these years. Now, your question is?
Yeah, it was really about, from the going from, what is the importance of this work to like, how did you begin, your kind of work on this subject, and how did it grow over time?
Well, it was started for me in 1960. That's a long time for many people here. I was doing my PhD at the University of London in 1960s in London, and I wanted to go to the Royal Geographical Society to see maps about Palestine. I did not find any. There were no maps about Palestine. I said, this is surprising again. The British have barely left Palestine 10 years ago, and how come they don't have maps of Palestine? Then I went to the British archives. Also, there is no Palestine. And looked at other places, British Library. Then someone told me, I said, look, there is a map here, this place here, where is it? I said, yeah, you want that place? It's called Israel. So they took me to another place where all the maps of Palestine have been stored there. The name Palestine crossed out, and the name Israel was put instead. And so I started collecting these maps slowly in Royal Geographical Society. And people think that when the British left Palestine, they put all the documents of Palestine in one big building. You go there and get them. This is not true at all. There has been bits and pieces of documents about Palestine in Britain in about 10 or 15 different places. The Commonwealth, the libraries, the archives, universities, but it's not in one place. The bulk of the material, of course, is one of the things Israel has stolen from us. I'll come to that in a moment. So all the British documentation of the British Mandate is taken over by Israel. But in terms of searching for this material, you go further from one step to another, and then you find that the Germans made an aerial survey of Palestine in 1917, and they kept them in Bavaria Museum. And I went there and I purchased all the documents, all the maps from the Bavarian Museum. There are, of course, you go to Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and you find documentation by the French. Then you could also make a visit to Istanbul, where the Ottomans have a lot of undiscovered documentation, still undiscovered. Then you go to Library of Congress, and you find lots of maps, usually from the British colony, which was in Jerusalem for a long time. And then you go to United Nations library, which has very extensive library, especially in 1948 and 49, about the war and armistice lines and how things moved and so on. This is very important for actual movement of forces during that time. Then, when you actually go through all these documents, one thing leads to another, and then you find that the British have not completed the survey of Palestine. They have done that in several stages, first in general stages, then in the 1936 rebellion of Palestine. They had to rush and make maps for military interest, especially in the West, what's called today the West Bank, because that was where the source of the rebellion is, the activity. And then you find that they done another set of military maps about Palestine in the Second World War, also for that purpose. But the British did not do proper survey. I don't want to bore you about these details, but you can find them in chapter 2 of the Atlas of Palestine, how they did and when and why they did that. Then there was a discovery, and that discovery is very interesting. The British, before they left in 1946, they decided to make an aerial survey of all of Palestine for all the areas they did not have time to finish. So they went on flights all over Palestine, not all over, but large part of Palestine. And I could not find where these aerial photos are. But I knew that they belonged to the RAF, Royal Air Force. So I heard, or I read in one of the references, someone saying they have this collection. I wrote a letter, nobody answered. I wrote another one. And then finally I found that there's a unit called Reconnaissance Unit, which actually provides information for the Allied forces in the Second World War. And they keep them there. And that place was not in London, in a small village in the north of London, in England. So I wrote a letter saying I would like to get 4 copies, 4 photos of a certain area in Palestine. No reply came, but then I phoned, and then a corporal replied. I said, could you please respond to my request for 4 photos? He said, what is it for? I said, look, I'm urban planner, and I'm studying how certain area has changed from pre-Second World War to today. I have new maps, new aerial pictures of the map, so I want to know how it was before. He said, but you need a letter from the country concerned. I said, my goodness, you need a letter from Israel. Well, I said, excuse me, this was under the British administration. It has nothing to do with Israel. This is the property of the British government. And so you are the ones who can give me the permission or not. He said, 1 minute. I'll speak to the admiral or some other guy. And he was silent in the line for about 10 seconds. I couldn't breathe, not knowing what the answer will be. And then he said, well, as long as it's for research, we give you the 4 photos. I said, thank you very much. He said, this is your contract number. And he gave me a contract number. Then I wrote another letter about a month later. Can I get 10 photos, please? The work is research. And then, can I get 50? And then finally, I got 5,000 acres. And of course, very expensive. Each one cost me 16 sterling pounds. And now we then started a lot of work to spread those. People who know geography, you have to rectify them, you have to tie them together, and anyway, it's a long story. So this took a long time. But I just want to remind you of one thing. When the Zionists came to Palestine, which is extremely important to know, it's not only Balfour who did the biggest sin. The British, of course, knew that. As soon as Weizmann got the letter from Balfour in 2nd of November, 1917, he came to see him a few months later. At that time, 1918, the British have not completed the conquest of Palestine. They are still working on it. And he said, that's Weizmann, said to Balfour, I want a survey of Palestine to know who owns every dönum of it. And he said, look, we're at war. He said, no, you have to give me the word that this will be your first task when you get to Palestine. And for the next several years, until 1922, the British were badgered by the Zionists to make a complete survey of Palestine. Now, how did they do that? One of the important things of being a big imperial power is that you have so many talents, so many people with experience. So they brought from Egypt the head of the survey, a British man, who had the survey of Egypt, to do that, to open a survey of Palestine based on Egyptian experience. And the system they have used, the Zionists said, we don't want topographical maps. We don't want to know where is the wadi, where is the street, where is the village. We want to know who owns everything and what is the responsibility of taking over the land. So we don't have that system. So the important system from Australia, system called Torrance system. This Torrance system makes you go to a place and you make a map of it, and then you bring the people of the land and you determine immediately on the spot who owns this land. And due to that, they have the ordinance, they call it Ordinance of 1928, which says every land in Palestine should be registered in this way. It's markation, it's the features, topography, and who also owns it. They also held a field court. If the people in the village is fighting over the ownership of one piece, they will hold a court, right spot, and decide. Anyway, this is described in that. But what struck me, that not only the British created Survey of Palestine to serve the interests of the Zionists, but even Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner, who was a Zionist, of course, he came to bring Jews to Palestine. So he arrived in Palestine from Jaffa port in 1st of July, 1920. And hardly he stayed in the office for more than 2 months. That I have a document sent by him to Britain listing 15 places in Palestine to remove the Arabic names of these places and to replace them by Hebrew names. And that is the start of converting Palestine into a Jewish colony, Jewish colony. So when you actually think of, this brings me back again to the aerial survey, which we got. That's why they have not finished doing the testing of the ownership of the land, more than 20% of Palestine. And this, they wanted to cover that deficiency by this aerial survey. And now the Israelis use that system, because it's not done in the West Bank, by claiming anything not registered properly to be state property, and they consider them to be the state, and they build settlement on it. So, but that is the tale. But I just want to bring to your attention that the elimination of Palestinian names and existence is not only physical. All colonies occupy a country, take over the land, keep the people there to serve them as labor. But in this case, they wanted the land and they did not want the people, because they wanted to call it empty land. And as you know, the colony history have the word terra nullius, and that land without people. So to give it that impression, terra nullius, they tell people we did not hurt anybody. And therefore, they wanted to eliminate the presence of Palestinians in the maps. And they do this today in history books. If you look at the history books in Israel today, they talk about Maccabees, and then suddenly jump to zero, 1897 Basel Conference in Switzerland, and then the area between 2,000 years is vacuum. It's not mentioned. And that is what we should fight. So I conclude this section by saying our war with Zionism is not a military war. It is an existence war. They wanted to wipe us completely from history and from geography, and by so doing, there is no crime because the body of the victim is not there. And that is what they have failed to do so far.
Thank you, Salman. I found one thing was very interesting in what you said about at the same time there's this force between, you know, this is a land without the people, but at the same time, you know, the first thing Weizmann wants is to map who owns the land. You know what I mean? So it's this implicit admission that every square inch of this is already owned by someone, and that we need to find a way to take it from them. You know.
Yes.
I wanted to go into a little bit more that, I mean, I feel like maybe people know your mapping work more than anything else, and in terms of, you know, that you collect and you also, you know, produce, you know, you bring together many sources of information and synthesize this into, you know, understanding what was there, you know, of Palestine before 1948 and how it's transformed, you know, and even projecting into the future on return, which to some degree I think is slightly lesser known in your work, but it's very much at the forefront. But I wonder if you could go into a little bit more the kind of volume of documentation that you've collected over the years, beyond just, you know, maps, aerial photographs, you know, documenting Palestine more broadly.
You know, by profession, I am an engineer, and by status, I'm a refugee. And so I have a case. I have a home taken away from me, and my job as one person of millions is to try to get it back. Now, all the information we collect should have a purpose. You don't just have it in a bookshelf or a library. You have to make use of it. But before I come to that, it's not easy to collect data, because you have a case. You have a case, like you go to court. And if you go to court, you have to have documentation. If this documentation is historical, you have to be a historian. If it's geographical, you have to bring a map. You have to be a geographer. If it is a matter of law, you have to study a bit about law and say what law is applicable in your case. If you have to convince people to come with you, you have to be good in information. You have to lobby people. So that we need to do all these things together in order to get our case. So when we collected these documents, we have, for example, the full documentation of the British mandate, the letters sent by district officers to Palestine and Palestine to London. There has been 16 districts in Palestine, and every district officer is required to send every 2 weeks a report to the High Commissioner and then to London about his area. And this report includes, number one, security. How are the people fighting us or not? And then the other things, agriculture, security, health, and on, and also how much taxation. So we have probably copies of maybe 730 reports by the district commissioners to Palestine. All the laws issued by the British Mandate, we have copies of them, about 4 volumes. How the boundaries of Palestine, borders of Palestine, how they created with Egypt, for example, with Jordan, with Lebanon and Syria. All this has taken a long time, some of them even before the mandate. We have documentation from 1837, how the documentation about the various governments and how it developed and so on. And so in total, we have probably 10,000 items of documents and various other things. But this is not the objective. The objective is to make use of them. And to do that, we are fortunate to have new technology, GIS technology, statistics, population. So they created a data for 4 million refugees, Palestinian refugees. We know their names, we know their children, we know their wife and grandmother and so on. We know where they come from, we know their ages. And we know today, for example, where they come from originally, and then we see which camp they are in, where are they located. It's not perfect, but it probably covers 70 to 80% of the refugees. So now we know who our, what shall we say, the subject of our research. Then we ask second question, what happened to their land and their villages? So there are surveys which we studied and how much was destroyed and where it is. And we found, compared them with satellite pictures of today, we find something very surprising, that of the villages, not the cities, about 85% of village sites are still vacant today. They have not built on them. So theoretically, or even practically, it is possible to build on the same site. So that's fact number one. It was surprising, but it's a fact. Second thing is, we said, who lives then on the land of the Palestinian refugees? It is not difficult, but we have created a database. Who are the Jews who are occupying it? Where are they? Where they come from? Russia, Arab countries, Ashkenazis, and so on. And where are their location, density of population? And again, we get very surprising results. That says 87% of all Jews live only in 12% of Israel's area. So actually, most of the village lands are empty. And this is the surprising results I arrived at in 1994, and I just couldn't believe it, because all the Israelis tell us when we speak to them in London, New York, say, yeah, where can you go back? It's all filled with people. You are going to create a Jewish Nakba? And of course, even if that's the case, no right for someone to take your home, even if he filled it. But it turned out that this is not true at all. 75% of Israel area is run by the army. They have camps, they have factories, they have training grounds, they have areas reserved for agriculture. They have the kibbutz, who occupy actually as guards. They guard the land of the refugees, are 1 to 2% of all the population. And then we actually made a map of the present situation in Israel. I use the word as it is geographically. And we find that if we return the refugees to their places, there will be very little displacement of the Jews if they like to live in peace. I presented this in a big conference, I mean big in terms of the kind of people who were there, all experts in the Middle East, at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, last April. And I showed that the international law of returning refugees could be implemented without any dislocation of the majority of the people who are existing. They are located in 3 areas: Tel Aviv, the bigger area, Jerusalem West, and Haifa. So I decided to make a plan for cantonization of those Jews, to give them cantons where they are majority, where they can practice their culture or their religion or whatever they want independently, which is, by the way, what the United Nations suggested in 1947. It never suggested that anybody should be kicked out. And then with that, we said, okay, now we know it's empty. Now we know what the refugees are. We created a network, not created, we created on the computer database, network of roads, where how would people return? And actually, we made examples of people, for example, in Bassa, where they come from, we know where they are in Palestine, and what road system they could use, and how many buses they need, and will be the crowded streets or not. It's all very feasible. For example, in the case of the settlers in Palestine, they have to bring them in ships and airplanes and so on. Our case was very simple because most of the refugees are far away from their homes by any distance from 0 to maximum 50 kilometers. If you go from Gaza to Al-Khalil, you find nobody. You know the case of Gaza, how it is being crowded. Everybody says crowded. Well, why is it crowded? Because the population of half of Palestine, the southern half Palestine, have been crammed into 1% of area Palestine. And they are the population of 247 towns and villages in southern Palestine put in one little corner, which is 20 kilometers by 30, something like that. So their density of Palestinians in Gaza, the density of Palestinians in Gaza are 7,000 persons per square kilometer. Huge density. But the settlers who took their land, what's their density? 7 persons per square kilometer. 1,000 times less. You know, if I made a study, if we, for example, wanted to reverse the situation, the refugees go back to their homes, and we get those settlers, I exclude the cities of Beersheba and Majd. If we bring those settlers in the land of the refugees in Gaza into Gaza, they will not fill 1/2 of a refugee camp in Gaza today. And staggering information. And the trouble is, we have every right possible, and we have every document to prove it, but we should do much more to make that a reality. We cannot just all the time beg. And I don't want to bring our subject to something else, but basically it's our duty to fight for our rights and to choose the leadership which will carry out these rights into reality.
Or at least advocate for them. I mean, some of these facts and statistics you were giving are amazing, and hopefully they're things that we can actually, through our work with Visualizing Palestine, maybe we can help to also disseminate these as to a wide audience. I had more questions, but I'm aware that, in terms of time, I'd love to make sure we open it up so everyone feels they can have their questions. So I wondered, maybe I would give one more kind of question, which is, it's kind of two things, but it's really about the legacy of your work and what you're planning for the medium to long term to make sure your work continues, make sure that what you've collected is available to people, that they the documentation doesn't kind of get lost or what's the word, without an institution behind things, they tend to to be lost, right? And secondly, how much so firstly, what is your vision, or would you like to see institutionally for your work? And the second thing is, I mean, from the work we've done over the last 7 years is Visualizing Palestine, one thing that's been really important to us is open licensing of the work that we produce. And also actually sharing the data behind it as much as we can, which we're trying to improve on, because at the beginning it's not something we were doing that well. So everything is Creative Commons license, everything can be downloaded and printed, etc. But also we're trying to open up really the resource behind that. So I wondered if number one, the institutional vision, and number two, if you have plans to really open up the data that you have, so people can use it in other ways, I mean, in positive ways for Palestine, obviously.
Yes, this is, of course, a very important point. I deal with a society in England called PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, and we are going to produce in a month or two a new atlas revising this survey. Just to tell you, they established this in 1865. It's now 150 years old and still going on till today. Still going on. It's all, it's not a government, it's a group of people. So we lack that. We lack the continuity. We lack even the stability of any organization. There is no value in any information which is stuck in the drawers. I'm reminded في آية في القرآن, I like to hear it, كالحمار يحمل أسفارا, يعني حمار ماشي وشايل كتب, encyclopedia. What's the point of doing that? يعني المهم, it has to be made into use. So now the electronics solve a lot of problems. I established Palestine Led Society in London in the year 2000, and still going. We are accepted in many universities and even at the United Nations. But I would like young people whose future is being decided by this information to be involved. So we need to open a center in Lebanon. We need to open a center in Gaza, and even a center in Amman, if they let us do that. The question of censorship is also very important. And even in places where we cannot reach them, technology could serve that. So your question is very apt. And we really have not only to get the information, digest it, and make it into an operation plan, but also to make people use it and believe it, especially the young people. We have, as you well know, 70% of our people, Palestinian people, are less than 35 maybe, and it's their future we are deciding now. So they should have a lead in that. And unfortunately, most of the work in this is volunteer work, like your work, and we should have a big institution. I told you this afternoon that the Israeli lobby in the US, which controls them by the throat, have 750 organizations working for them, although they are sure of every congressman. Anyway, so the idea is I would like suggestions for anybody how the young people should have this information. Hopefully, if we set up a center here in Lebanon, they will make use of it. and other places, but the continuity is something which we must preserve, let alone, of course, that no official body, Arab body or Palestinian body, support us. But that is one of the things we have to live with. So it is, if I remember, that's your comment, last comment? I mean, no, did I answer you? You wanted?
Yeah, I think broadly, I guess, yeah, I mean, did you have specific plans of how to open up that information?
Yes, yes. We have tentative plans with some establishments in the Middle East to set up centers for Palestine Lands Society with all the information, provided that it reaches the young people. And for example, we could set it up in England, but in England it costs so much money and have visa for young people to go there. So it will be much more practical to set up here, give them the same information like they have in London, and they can use it. And then from that, you have to change, you have to convert that information into a popular movement, that we have a right and we have to fight for it, and we have every thing to support us, either international law or in facts or in reality. People have to convert their dreams to plans, and then plans into action. And that's the only way to reach your goal. I'm always reminded by somebody sitting in a cafe in Leipzig or Vienna some years ago, sipping coffee there and telling his people, in 50 years' time, I'll get you a state in another country. And that was Herzl. He would be crazy to say that. But they worked on it and did it, but of course, not for long, I hope.
Thank you so much. Just one thing, actually, before we ask questions, there's a few people sitting in the aisle here. There's space inside, so if people could let them in, unless you really want to sit in the aisle. Okay. Anyway, there is space if you'd like to come in. So really, I mean, thank you so much, Salman, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who would are burning with questions. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, if they'd like to contribute or ask a question.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Dr. Abu Sitta. I have already been witnessing many of your lectures back in Palestine, in Jordan, and here in Lebanon. I'm so glad to see you again here. My question has to do with the issue that is coming to the surface, especially now in Palestine, about people selling Israeli embassies all over. They are busy to have Palestinian people, the diaspora, selling land in 1948. And this has been a lot of activities inside the Israeli embassies regarding that. My question is very specific. Does the selling of land, which happened, we know that some Palestinians, unfortunately, some families had already sold some of their properties in historical Palestine to the Israeli Jewish agency of. So my question is, how much this gives the Israeli, the Zionist side, the legitimacy or the legal evidence that they have right on the land that they have bought from Palestinians, or according to the international law, even if this land had been sold to Zionists, it stays occupied land. This is my first concern, that I would like your comment on that, because we have been confronted on that issue sometimes. Right. My second question, it's not a question, it's a comment more, that today the Palestine Jewish or the Zionist fight is also the demography. You know, the Zionists are terrified by the demography issue. The Palestinians we are today in historical Palestine, even inside Palestine, we are almost 50% of the population. And this is a huge this is a huge threat to the nature of this state that has to be a pure Jewish state, regardless if they are occupying 20% of the land or occupying 80% of the land. They still think that to create a Jewish state, pure state, that has to be a Jewish majority. And Palestinian presence, existence in that in the land threatens their future. And this is also one of the battles that we have to look at when we are trying to prove, not to prove, because we know it is our land. That's not a question that we have to discuss here. So these are the two things I would like to get your comments. Thank you.
Let me respond to the first one quickly. Give a chance to some people to move places if they want. Palestinians selling their land to Jews. This subject has many manifestations. It was very common in 1948 to say that Palestinians have sold their land. Who did that? Some groups, some societies in Arab countries and Zionists. How come they have the same aim? Basically, the Arab countries have suffered a great defeat in Palestine in 1948. They failed to protect Palestinians. Instead of Israelis, or actually Jewish settlers under the British, managed to control 6% of Palestine, they ended up with 78% of Palestine. Now, the Israelis are also happy with this, statement that the Arabs have lost because the Palestinians sold their land, because it gives them a weapon saying that why should you defend Palestinians? They already sold their land. Now, briefly, the 6% which the Israelis got in 1948, 2% of them during the Ottoman Empire because they were normal Ottoman subjects. And the rest they have done by about 100 laws created by Herbert Samuel. Now, in every situation I looked at, it was not the area of the land which matters. The Greeks and the Jews own in Cairo in 1948 more than half of the main streets in Cairo. So this is not the point. The point was that the Israelis brought an army by officers who were trained in veterans of the Second World War, 120,000 soldiers in about 9 brigades, and who were stationed in every little corner of Palestine under the British and under the kibbutz. So that's how they got it. Palestine was lost by a military conquest of a European trained and originating European trained army of the Jews in Europe. That's the question. Now, all this, the property of Palestinians is already recorded. There are 500,000 records of individual ownership cards of ownership in Palestine. So that's beyond question. Now, if people sold land to Jews after 1948, they have created this absentee law. It's a long subject, it's written about, but the idea of that is that every land taken by Palestinians is rented to the kibbutz or the other Jews by a rental agreement of 49 years became 99 years. So no Israeli settler in Palestine 1948 have a title deed, يعني ما عندوش كشان لأني piece of land. It's all by the government. Now, what we hear about in Jerusalem is that some people are selling their houses under pressure and so on, with the temptation of paying millions of dollars for them and giving them American citizenship. These situations are not legal in any case. They are called under duress, that people under occupation are forced to do things which are not legal. In France, things done with the Germans are all revoked because they are done under occupation. So this is all illegal. There will be a time to undo it. But basically, the second point about demography, I am disgusted by the argument of the Israelis or Zionists when we meet them in New York or London. They say, but we have to have Jewish majority. They are telling us that Palestinians having children is a crime. And that is, if that is not the epitome of racism, I don't know what is. Is it a crime that Palestinians have children and their presence in their land is a threat to them? If that is a threat to them, so be it. And that is, I cannot find any definition of racism worse than that.
Someone was saying something very similar to me the other day, which is the way to, win a debate with the Zionist in polite company in the West is to basically ask those two questions. Do you support the right of return of Palestinian refugees? And if not, why not? And if they can only come up with basically the demographic argument, which is a very clearly racist argument, then they kind of lose the debate. But probably they change the subject. So other questions in the audience?
I would like to commend you for the great effort that you've been undertaking for the last 20 years or so. This is really, it amounts to the sum of the total Palestinian struggle for liberation. But I think the data you've presented actually needs to materialize in the liberation of Palestine itself. Concerning the demographics, the soft Zionist scholar Benny Morris came out a couple of weeks ago to say that the Zionist entity or the Hebrew state would eventually come to an end, and he set a date actually, which is 2050 or 2070, by the utmost. This is his prophecy, quote unquote. This is one thing. I would like to suggest to you the so-called no-state solution. Because as we know, there are no two-state solution, one-state solution. So how about the no-state solution, which encompasses two peoples? One Palestine, geographic Palestine, from the river to with two peoples. Thank you.
I wish every Palestinian not to fall in the trap of one state or two state or whatever. This is a trap. Even when they floated the idea of two-state solution, you know very clearly it was a Zionist plan, and they dropped it when they don't need it anymore. Our case is very simple. We have been kicked out of our homes and we want it back. This is a human right, and this is the issue. The issue is people must return home. The question of one state or two states is of no relevance because this is a political act. Recognition of a state is a political act done by a state towards another. It can be revoked, it can be increased, it can be divided. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and so on. This is not part of international law or human rights. This is a political decision. Today, yesterday, Trump did not recognize the government of Venezuela. So forget about that. I never discuss this, even when Israelis talk about it. I say, I have a home, I want to get it back. And when I get there, in democracy and in freedom, we decide what to do with this country You can make it republic, you can make it monarchy, you can make it communist. This doesn't interest me, it doesn't interest anybody. The basic human rights must be fulfilled. Everything else is a trick to avoid discussing the human right.
I have a question. Hi. All the way at the back. Yeah, so my name is Majd Shahabi. I'm part of the team that works on the Palestine Open Maps project. And I was really excited when you mentioned that that you want young people to actually have access to the material that you've collected and you've been utilizing so far.
After this, sorry.
And I think like one of the things that we've been really good at with the Palestine Open Maps project is to actually like reach a lot of people to help us in the effort of disseminating, creating, but also disseminating the geographic material that we've collected about Palestine. So for example, not this Saturday, but the one after, we're having a mapathon where we're having like a crowd of people actually like come together and vectorize or extract the material out of the maps, the 1 to 20,000 scale maps. And what I would like to like kind of like come back to is like how do you envision the role of young people in actually extracting the data and utilizing the data, especially given that it's like right now it's not really like we can open the Atlas of Palestine and it's just like gorgeous and heartbreaking, but at the same time, like if I want to do any kind of analysis on the data that's in it, it's like a few orders of magnitude more difficult. So like can you talk specifically about the role of young people in the project that you're discussing?
The simplest thing and the thing which everybody can do, first of all, every family must let their children write an essay or a picture or a map about their village in Palestine or any other village. Education starts at home. They should be involved in knowing who they are. They don't have to go in planes and the so-called birthright. They can easily talk about their own village from their family. That's number one. Number two, the education system has deteriorated regarding Palestine a lot, thanks to Oslo, which is a big problem here. Our friend Mahmoud Zidane knows this very well. We distributed 700 copies of Atlas Palestine to every UNRWA school. And I'm dismayed to say that only few of them had made use of that. So there should be a revival of identity, that people should know who they are. When they grow up more, they can create projects like you are doing, like painting, like drawings, like all kinds of things. Next step after that, they should form themselves into lobby groups or education groups. And the ultimate aim, of course, when they are 20 or so, they should insist on being democratically represented so that their rights are respected. We lack this. Unfortunately, in the years back, we have a great deal of surge, actually, of identification. We have to revive that again. And what you do, multiplied by 100 times, should be found in every Palestinian, every Arab society, in fact, because this is an Arab case.
And for sure, I hope that's a conversation we can continue also afterwards, like how we can work together on maximizing who's
Of course.
Able to see and use this. I think we'll do all the remaining questions. Maybe we put them together. So everyone who has a question, raise their hand, and we'll go around everyone at once, and then we can just being aware of time. So I think we have 3 people. Okay. Okay, I'll take a note of each one, and please, it would be great if you actually people could say their name first, and if they have a particular interest, it would be great as well.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Muna Fawaz. Thank you so much for this presentation. I've been a fan of your work since I was a student in the States and watched you present those villages 20, 30 years ago. So thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the idea of property and private property and how the mapping of land and its making ownable eventually facilitates the fact that it can be sold or someone can claim it as theirs. And in Lebanon, we've been working on the destruction of the commons because of this form of mapping. And hearing you today, it's the first time I hear about how this process of mapping in Palestine was actually instituted by the British Army on the request of the Zionist agency to make the land ownable so they can buy it. Eventually, there's two questions that seem to be contradictions in my head, and I'm wondering if you can help me. The first is that they ended up not buying anything. They actually occupied it. So did they have a change of plans? And second, do these documents become something that we can use because they eventually had mapped property, and property was obviously not the Zionist entities? Thank you.
My name is Hani Abu Jabin. I have one comment. I mean, going back to land without people, people without land, no one has ever used Jerusalem as a Palestine with people. It has been going on ever since that the Western man knows. Nobody uses the Crusades that took so many people to come over and fight who? People with land with no people. But my question to you is, when you spoke about armies coming in and being settled, did they come in with their armaments and their tanks and their aeroplanes? And was that allowed by the British, who were supposed to protect the indigenous population of Palestine?
Shall we take the third or start with you?
With roads and maps and everything. Sorry.
There were two more, were there, or one?
Yeah. My name is Tariq Mahmood. I'm taking Mona's question, very similar. The British, when they occupied different parts of the world, the question of ownership was brought in at certain times. So, for example, in the Kashmir area, they sold all of us in one go as the whole country to another person, and then we became exiled. At what point in Palestine when you started talking, and by the way, it was a fabulous talk, and I'm honored to have had the chance to listen to you. What was the system of ownership before the arrival of Britain? Was it, for example, like a community structure? Was it other sort of powerful rulers, or like in our sort of zones, whoever had the gun controlled large tracts of land or whatever? What were the systems prior to that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple that we can group together. So I think maybe was there one more person had a question, or Alice, this is everyone. Okay. Okay, Jumana will have one at the end. So basically, I think we have maybe 2 or 3 questions in there. One was, I think what Mona raised at the beginning, and also Hani raised, which was about the military takeover of Palestine. Number one was, did it represent a change of plan for the Zionists? And number two, did Britain actively facilitate the armaments and the military that came in order to do that?
Do you mean the time in the spring of 1948 when the Haganah started taking over Palestine, right? Yeah. Yes. Yes, they came. We don't want to dwell on that too much, but in brief, one of the things Herbert Samuel in 1920 did was to create the nucleus of the Haganah. They call it kibbutz watchmen. And they trained them slowly, and this training took a big turn in the 1936 revolt, when they actually trained them in the night warfare. They called night squad. And they gave them uniforms. And sometimes they paraded as English soldiers attacking villages which have been revolting against the British. And the story goes on like that. So they were trained into, regimented into battalions and brigades. And at the beginning of 1948, their number was 60,000. If you follow the flow of Jews from Second World War until 1948, you'd find that the average age of people was less than 50, from 20 to 50. And Ben Gurion himself kicked out old men and women and young children. He said he wanted a fighting force. And they brought this fighting force to the extent that let me just rewind here, in middle of March 1948, he had 60,000 soldiers.
Did they have tanks? Where did they get the tanks? We were under the British landing.
The what?
I think he was asking where they get the armaments, the tanks, the airplanes.
Yes. The armaments, I mean, these are details, but we can talk about them. The armaments, some of them, they have secret plants, factories underground, and some of them they brought from Czechoslovakia as agricultural machinery. But we don't want to get into details of that. I just want to emphasize one point, not very well known. The partition plan has no legal value. It's only a recommendation. And even if it was applied, it was never allowed any expulsion of anybody. Chapter 2 and 3 of the partition plan says clearly that the majority rules in that area, while the minority have full rights, including election and education. So, in the middle of March 1948, 4 months after the partition plan, the United Nations dropped the partition plan and said it cannot be applicable without bloodshed. And it was agreed to by the United States that it should be dropped. They suggested instead trusteeship over Palestine. Instead of Britain, it will be United Nations. Ben Gurion got mad. That will spoil his plans of taking over Palestine. So he decided to take over Palestine against everything. And they start Plan Dalit from 1st of April till 15th of May 1948, 6 weeks. And in these 6 weeks, Haganah forces expelled the population of 220,000 villages, making half the total refugees, right? So by the end of the second half of the 1948, they grew into 120,000. Anyway, I call it military conquest. What's the second point? We can talk more about that.
The other point. I think there was a part of this was whether that was a change of plan, but I think the other questions were about land ownership, really, and documentation. So there was the question, I forgot your name at the back, who. So he was asking about what was the previous land ownership structure before the British kind of changed it.
To save time, if you go to chapter 2 under land, you find that the description of the applicable laws in the Ottoman times in Palestine and how they converted into British-made laws, including the land settlement law of 1928 and land transfer regulations of 1940. It will be discussed in some detail. But there was ownership of every piece of land, and they all paid taxes and so on. So the subject is a bit detailed, I think, for this discussion.
Mona, the second part of your question was about using documentation, historic documentation for, I can't remember the purpose.
Thinking about that mapping that was done in 1928 with the intent of making land ownable so that it's sellable, so the Zionist entity can buy it, right? This is the the idea. If that's the case, do we have that mapping today, and can we use it? Because
Okay.
in fact, those who own the land at that point, even if we accepted the premise that land is ownable, those who own the land were
So it's specifically the ownership records then. So it was to say that you know this kind of very detailed mapping of ownership that happened, even though you know it was for the purposes of colonization. You know how much can those records be reconstructed of specific ownership of land, and how can they be used? And
We have clear maps, like scaled to 10,000, showing the Jewish ownership, and the rest is all Palestinian. So the maps are there. They have even two sets of maps. One, the Palestinian government maps, and since 1936, the Jews have created their own survey maps to know which land they bought or controlled. If anyone wants to study this in detail, you have to remember one thing, that the British documented land ownership is 1,491,000 dunams, while the Israelis say it's 2,000. Of course, I describe in my atlas where the forgery of Israeli claims to be. So I have never seen, neither in Bosnia nor in any country like Abkhazia or even Guatemala, where there is refugees returning. I have never seen any country more documented than Palestine. This is the least of our worries.
thank you. Jumana, you had one question to add.
The nature of my
You are allowed to ask a question?
if you allow me all, the nature of my question is a bit different from what's being spoken about. So, Dr. Salman, what you're in a stage in life that states that there's a continuity that really needs to be held by others, right? Life goes through generations, and I'm trying to put the question together because it's quite a large one in my head. When you are presented in talks and speak about the topic, and we have a taste of it in a smaller scale with Visualizing Palestine, spoken about is the content, is what faces everybody, the maps, the data, all of that. And that's a whole segment of what you do and who you are. But the part that I have never heard of, and rarely do people speak about in the value of content that they bring, is themselves the structures that they have gone through, the collaborations, the falls, the stumbling parts, the challenges. We're standing here, Ahmed, myself, there's Naji, there's Majd, there's Hanan, all of us working partly under the umbrella of Visualizing Palestine or fully. And we're 7 years old, our 8th year. And I don't know whether we will last 40 years, 50 years, or we'll hand this over to a next generation 150 years later. Salman Abu Sitta, that's the content and the data and the maps and the conversations about Palestine. I'm looking to be educated by a wise man who has gone a lifetime that shows to be very peaceful as you're sitting here and we're speaking to you. But I am certain that there is so much that was stirred in your lifetime to get here and to get us this content, that to me, that bit is more important to learn about, I dare say, than the content about Palestine, because like you said, the content is out there. How we collaborate, how we come together, how we network, how we relay generation to generation is at the heart of perhaps why it's taking us that long and we're not there yet.
You are absolutely correct. There is no question about that. I made a remark about Palestine Exploration Fund, an organization by interested people, lasted 150 years and has publications, has a board all this time. This is something we lack. We are now motivated by this because we have a case of survival, of existence, not only on land, but in mind, in history, in books, and therefore our task is tremendous, but so far we are still here. Now, your question is quite right. How to continue? We are trying very much. There are some plans under preparation so that this work would be extended everywhere by interested parties. But I must admit, we are still short of acceptable level of success. And we should really overcome that, because you know, the officers who came to make me a refugee, they have landed in Palestine only 2 weeks before, and they have maps, and they were given in details, go here and here and here. So they could occupy me because they have the information which their feet did not tread on this land much earlier. So we should, and I claim, I mean, I try not to claim, I try to set up, to continue the work of Palestinian society, but as I said, it must be extended. One of the things I mentioned to you this afternoon, we started an international competition among young Palestinian architects. So far, we have 10 universities this year. Luckily, here in Lebanon, we have 2, American University of Beirut and American Lebanese University. The graduating class in architecture, we give them 20 villages to select from and give them data about the villages. And we ask them to redesign that village with the new population, with the new data we give them. We give them 8 maps and so on. And the competition is announced every year in September. And there are prizes for this and so on. So this is one way, but there are lots of ways. And I agree with you. We are far behind in the continuity of using this information for the young people. But we should continue. We should continue.
Thank you so much, Salman. I think in terms of time, we've reached the end. And well, that's a very good sign to get spontaneous applause when you're halfway through thanking someone.
Well, thank you for your patience to stay that long.
So thank you so much for your time. And just to direct everyone who's here to remind, as Jumana said, actually, anyone who missed the exhibition, we have some of the pieces on display outside. We probably have anyone who's not signed up for to our newsletter of Visualizing Palestine, and also to Dar Nimr. I think there's an opportunity outside to sign up to that. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes before we get kicked out of the building. So any other questions, please come and see us. So thank you very much again, and thank you everyone for coming.